So there's been a story that's been breaking in the news that is difficult and hard to bear and has some very serious learning points to it. So I'm going to read from a manuscript that was published in 2020 before the news broke this spring. And it's research done by Eric Hansen. He first of all did the research in 2009, and then he revised it in 2020. And he's addressing the residential school system in Canada. So I'm going to read this section. It's not the whole article, of course, but it's written so powerfully and clearly, and it really lays out facts that maybe we don't have access to, and maybe we have an idea about who's responsible solely for this problem. Of course, problem is an understatement. So it's very helpful to hear this. The term residential schools refers to an extensive school system set up by the Canadian government. That's important to know. By the Canadian government. I did not know that. I had another bias going in another direction. I thought it was another group. And it was administered by churches that had the nominal objective of educating Indigenous children, but also the more damaging and equally explicit objectives of indoctrinating them into Euro-Canadian and Christian ways of living and assimilating them into mainstream white Canadian society. The residential school system officially operated from the 1880s into the closing decades of the 20th century. That's another thing that I wasn't familiar with, that it went so long and that I have known so little about this. The system forcibly separated children from their families for extended periods of time and forbade them to acknowledge their Indigenous heritage and culture or to speak their own languages. Children were severely punished if these, among other strict rules, were broken. Former students of residential schools have spoken of horrendous abuse at the hands of residential school staff, physical, sexual, emotional, and psychological abuse. Residential schools provided Indigenous students with inappropriate education, often only up to lower grades, that focused mainly on prayer and manual labor in agriculture, light industries such as woodworking, and domestic work such as laundry and sewing. Residential schools systematically undermined Indigenous, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit cultures across Canada, disrupted families for generations, severing the ties through which Indigenous cultures taught, and sustained and contributed to a general loss of language and culture. Because they were removed from their families, many students grew up without experiencing a nurturing family life and without the knowledge and skills to raise their own families. The devastating effects of the residential schools are far-reaching and continue to have a significant impact on Indigenous communities. The residential school system is widely considered a form of genocide because of the purposeful attempt from the government and church to eradicate all aspects of Indigenous cultures and life worlds. From the 1990s onwards, the government and the churches involved, so there was not just one church, there were churches involved, Anglican, Presbyterian, United, and Roman Catholic, began to finally acknowledge their responsibility for an education system, a scheme that was designed specifically to kill the Indian in the child. Finally, in June of 2008, the Canadian government issued a formal apology in Parliament for the damage done by the residential school system. But in spite of these apologies, the effects still remain. So when you hear a story like this, and there's so many, throughout history, the harm that people have done to other human beings is atrocious and heartbreaking and beyond description in some cases. As spiritual practitioners, how do we handle this kind of information? And without the teachings, I would honestly admit to the fact that I would be absolutely enraged and justifying my righteous anger and putting those people into the boxes of monsters, the people who perpetrated these crimes against these children, irredeemable, worthy only of the worst punishment. But obviously there's other ways of viewing the situation. And right off the bat, we know from our training in Shantideva, anger is not, first of all, not the solution to this. So I'd like to quote Venerable Chödrön, who began chapter 6 with these words. When you think about people that you can't stand, does that image change or does it remain consistent? We have assigned them a personality and that's all they are. These people are monsters who did that to those children. That's all they ever will be. And I have no choice about how to feel in response to their actions. They are harmful, horrible, and anyone in their right mind would hate them. They would beat them up and banish them. And when we think of them, we call up those same emotions. So we're hooked by a caricature of that person. And even if we meet that person who is impermanent, everything they say is bad and disgusting because they would never do anything other than that. There's no way I could feel anything different. And then, of course, our mind is hooked on blame instead of seeing this situation that is absolutely filled with so many causes and conditions. So the question that I've been asking since this news broke this spring, and I'll get to this in a minute, is why was nothing said? People knew about this. This has been going on for more than 100 years. Why was nothing said? Why was nothing done? Oh, well, actually, there was plenty said. Plenty. I'll give you one example, because if I gave you all the examples, we'd be here till tomorrow. In 1904, at the age of 51, Dr. Bryce was recruited by the Government of Canada to be the Chief Medical Health Officer of what was then known as the Department of Indian Affairs. The first task they gave him was to send him out to study the health of the children in residential schools. The government was already receiving reports at that time that up to 50% of the children were dying in residential schools. 50%. Statistics showed that students in residential schools were dying at rates between 24 to 69%, and he was sent out to study what was happening. So in 1907, Bryce submitted a report that was extremely critical of the health conditions in residential schools. He blamed the federal government for negligence that led to these high death rates. They were being starved to death. They were dying of TB. We know that TB is just like COVID-19. It's spread through aerosol droplets. There was no testing going on. There was no TB shots. And he really believed that once he proved the problem to the government and gave them a solution, the government of Canada would do the right thing. How could anyone in their right mind allow children to die like this? But here it is, you're going to hear Canadian citizens say these three words. But Canada refused. Nothing was done. So news of this residential school system has been exploding in the news since May of this year, because now there's people who are finally listening to the survivors, and they're going to the sites with this new well, it's actually not new technology, but it's technology that uses radar, that they can send these radar waves into the ground, and it's not able to find bones or organic material, but this instrument can detect where the ground has shifted because of graves being dug. So since the end of May, several Indigenous communities across the country have identified well over 1,000 human remains through getting to these areas with this technology, mostly of children at former sites of residential schools. So these kids were plucked from their families, sent away to school, and never seeing their parents again, and the parents never seeing their children again, often with no explanation of what happened. So again, as a spiritual practitioner, what I would love to do is, instead of seeing that those people, so many of them are dead, right? They're dead, they're long gone. But there are people who are still in alive who worked in government at the time in Canada, who were teachers or were involved with this whole plan, they're still alive. So I'd love to sit down with them and ask them, what were you thinking? What was driving your decision making? What did you believe and what did you try and investigate about their culture? Did you go and study their religion? Did you find out what their religion was about? Or did you just see them as being that because of your religion, you believe they're all going to go to hell, and this is how you're going to save them? And did you go and interview families before you plucked these children away and find out how they were loving their children and taking care of them? Or did you again just see them as a group of people who are living in a way that's so foreign that you're going to do the right thing and save these kids, and instead send them to a very early tragic death? So I think it would be so helpful to sit down and hear the reasoning. And we probably would be shocked at what people would tell us about the wrong views they adopted, what they were told, what they were taught. Maybe there was fear involved. Maybe there was just, inability to assess the situation clearly. And they thought they were doing the right thing. And then how is their mind decades later, if they're still alive, reflecting back on what took place in those schools? And then, of course, as we know, the karma that was created by these people, everyone involved in the planning, those who executed what happened in the schools, that's an interesting word to use, isn't it? But the choices that were made in these classrooms every single day with these innocent little kids. And how do you live with that? And how do you live with that as you're dying? And to know that they're in a terrible suffering place if they've already passed away, or just the suffering they experienced later in life. So the only response we can have as spiritual practitioners is compassion. When you think about all the causes and conditions that came together for this to go on for so long, and the suffering of the children, their families, the government officials, the teachers, the religious people, everyone who is involved. And compassion is the only response that actually can come up. And I think it's also important, and I'm saying this to myself, to recognize that there's every possibility in the past that I have created similar karma, doing very heinous, cruel things, and not to look at that group of people as, oh, I would never do that. Those people are just so whatever. And to realize that it's not only, purification that we need to do daily with the 4 opponent powers and to create merit, but to continue to strive to attain full awakening. And then, of course, if we have one moment of a thought that you are a monster, I can't stand to even look at you, well, then bodhicitta is not a possibility either. Not even possible, because we can't live out one single sentient being. And as we heard over and over again from Geshe Tabke this past teaching, and we're hearing it again in this book that's being taught by Geshe Yeshe Lundrup. Here's a passage from chapter 2 in Pramanavartaka. Love, compassion, sympathic, joy, and equanimity are able to replace or suppress such negative states of mind as malice, envy, or partiality. But they cannot uproot such attitudes because they do not strike directly at the root of such states of mind, which is self-grasping. Only the wisdom realizing no self is able to strike directly at the root of all negative states of mind, which is described also as defiled ignorance of the view of self. So let's go after the real enemy and have compassion for the others who are making mistakes, including ourselves.